Today we're going to talk about Christian symbols. Christian symbols and whether or not these symbols of Christianity or of God, atheism in general, should be displayed anywhere publicly, especially in places like classrooms. Should we be displaying public symbols in classrooms? Now, also, does our display of Christian symbols in classrooms point to anything? As a matter of fact, does the complaint against the display of Christian symbols point to anything? So today's episode is going to be simply entitled, "You Can Ban All the Symbols, but Without God, There Wouldn't Be a Classroom." And my point here is that it turns out our effort to ban symbols, the culture's effort to ban symbols of God in classrooms, is simply another evidence that God exists. And I'll explain that in a minute. But first, let's just talk about where I've written about this online. You can see at coldcasechristianity.com, I've written about this article. You can ban all the symbols, but without God, there wouldn't be a classroom. You can find the larger article. Now, sometimes when you submit an article to another website, they will edit it. So my article is actually a longer, probably an unedited version of one that appeared earlier at Voices, which is the Christian Post website for commentary and different articles. I posted this article there. I submitted it there. But you'll see that the longer version is probably the one always you'll find on our website. Now, in that article, I talk about some recent stories that have come out in the news about how efforts have been made by people in the public who have tried to ban Christian symbols from classrooms. So I point to these articles, and you can see them linked in my article, but I'll just kind of cover them briefly with you here. So here's the first article. It is "In God We Trust, Removed from the Classroom After Atheist Parents Complain." Now, this one is, I'll just cite a couple of lines from this, because what you have is a parent who complained that there were symbols of Christianity or symbols of God worship, pointing to God, or even using the word God, that were seen in the classroom as part of the decorations. So here's what the article says. It says that a Wisconsin fourth grade school teacher at Roosevelt Elementary School had to remove Christian symbolism, quote unquote, from her classroom after a parent who's an atheist complained. Now, among the items that caused the offense were a cross, a poster that read "In God We Trust," and a picture frame that included the American flag and the words "God Bless America." Now, you could argue, look, this is just something that we're simply displaying the words that are found on U.S. currency or that are part of the rich history of the nation, whatever you want to say about that. But the parent objected to this. And the article says this: that television station WTMJ reported that the parent, whose name is Rob Moore, was quote-unquote infuriated and quote-unquote fuming over the classroom decorations. He said the items were removed after his complaints, so they were taken down. Now, it just so happens that Moore is a president of a Freedom from Religion Foundation chapter. So just to be clear, it's not as though this is not somebody who doesn't have skin in the game. This is somebody probably whose kids would recognize that these are the kinds of things that would offend him, and reported that these existed. Or maybe he just came in during an open house and he saw these things and he took offense to them, because he is, after all, a president of the Freedom from Religion chapter in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So that's one of the articles I linked to, and you can see that it's clear that for the most part, these folks, people who complained about this anyway, do not want this kind of symbolism, symbols about God in the classroom. Interestingly, ironically, their complaints actually confirm the existence of God. Let me show you another article written in a similar vein. And this is at AZ Central. This is in Arizona. "Religious symbols in classroom stir dispute in Peoria schools." So what is it that is actually causing this fuss? Is simply, and I'll read to you from the article. It says here that Andrew Seidel, an attorney for, again, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, said that Bibles kept inside a teacher's desk for personal reading outside of school hours, that's acceptable. But this teacher happened to have a Bible that was prominently displayed. It was actually on top of her desk. So that Bibles that or other religious items prominently displayed, those are not acceptable. He says that the line can be hard to draw sometimes. A teacher wearing a cross necklace is acceptable, but a shirt with a religious statement might not be. My whole point is not to explore so much whether it's right or wrong, or what the politics should be, or what our view should be from a perspective of culture related to whether or not we allow for these types of religious symbols, but instead to say that it turns out that our complaints against such symbols are actually a demonstration for the very thing we're opposing. Let me give you one more article that I cite in my article, and that is this one from, this is in Florida, okay? This is a teacher in Florida. And this teacher in Florida reportedly banned students in her class from wearing a cross. And then she ended up being threatened with legal action. So here you have a teacher. It's not that she's trying to display symbols. She's trying to ban those symbols on the part of any one of her students who might be wearing such a symbol, like a cross on your neck, a t-shirt that maybe has something that related to God, or a statement related to God on it. Here's what the article says. It says that a Tampa, Florida high school teacher has prohibited several students from wearing cross necklaces in her classroom. And the school district is now opening an investigation into the matter. So basically, she's opposed to. Now you might think, well, how could you even approach this with a student? Well, here's what the teacher said. The teacher said, "I need you to take your necklace off." And the student asked, "Well, why?" And the teacher refused to explain, stating, "That's disrespectful. You have to take it off." The student did not want to be disrespectful, so she took it off. And she felt bad, though, because she felt like she was being forced to deny her faith. So now, I'm not really quite sure how old the students are in this classroom, but it's pretty clear that you have a situation here where either somebody is complaining from outside the classroom that the teacher is displaying symbols of God, or someone is in the classroom, a teacher who's is complaining that students are displaying symbols of God. And it turns out that what you have are people who would actually argue that we should not display symbols of, I'm sure these folks believe, that there is no God, and that we should not be in a place as a culture where we're compelling people to think there is by displaying symbols. But it turns out that their complaint, ironically, demonstrates that God exists. So how can it be that an objection against the display of symbols about God in the classroom actually demonstrates that God exists? And if there was no God, there would be no creation here involving classrooms. So there wouldn't even be a classroom if it wasn't for the fact that there is God. But it turns out the complaints against God actually demonstrate that God exists. Well, how could that be the case? Okay, well, a number of things. And I've written about these in depth out on our website. So I'll be pointing you during this segment to some of the articles that I've written that will help to explain why I'm making this case. It turns out that classrooms are the place in which we receive information. A case is made based on the evidence, let's say for science, for example. Certain scientific experiments occur, and then people will actually draw inferences from evidence, and then make inferences, by the way, are our ability to freely assess evidence and come to a conclusion between available options. That means that we have to have the freedom to actually choose between available options. Classrooms demonstrate our need to have the ability to choose freely between options. You cannot reason if there isn't the freedom first to choose between options. And there's the problem. How do we get this kind of free agency? How do we get the kind of freedom we're talking about that allows classrooms to make sense, to actually function under an atheistic worldview in which God does not exist? Is it possible for us to have that kind of freedom to think? Do we have immaterial minds that can make free choices? Or are we nothing more than physical brains that simply react to physical events that occur in our brain, as Sam Harris, the neuroscientist who's also an atheist philosopher. As he argues, he says, look, I mean, his view as an atheist is that we are in a universe that is largely deterministic, a physical universe in which every event is based on physicalities. So you may be thinking what you think are thoughts from an immaterial mind, but they are simply chemical reactions from a material brain. And you have no ability to change your brain chemistry. You basically are thinking thought, well, not thinking thought, you're experiencing the outcome of physical events over which you have no prior control. Neurons fire. You cannot control the way those neurons fire. They were predetermined by the nature of the universe, entirely deterministic, entirely physicalistic. Any sense in which you think you have free will, according to the atheist Sam Harris, is simply a matter of you having an illusion of free will, when in fact you don't have the ability to choose freely. He's written about this in a book called Free Will. And the idea here is that under an atheist, and I think he's spot on, I think if all we have is space-time matter in the universe, that's it. You have space-time matter in the universe. And physics and chemistry act on space, time, and matter. Then all you have is a universe that is entirely physical, and like dominoes that fall in a sequence. They only fall because a domino first touches them, falls against them. Dominoes don't have the ability to freely step out of the domino chain. So you have what's called event causation, which is simply the causation that when things are caused by the physical events of prior events that cause them to fall, like a domino that falls in a chain. And then you have agent causation, which is assumes first of all there are free agents in the world. How do you get free agents under atheism? That is the question. Now, I've written about this quite a bit. And in one of these articles you'll find online, it really talks about whether or not we accept the existence of minds to begin with. Is everything physical? If all we are is physical brains, and there is no immaterial mind that has the freedom to move outside of physical prior events, if all you are is a brain, then how in fact do you ever make choices that aren't simply a matter of precursor events that are physical before you? In other words, in order to have the freedom to choose between options in a classroom, for classrooms to make any sense at all, you have to have the free agency that only God can provide. Atheism does not provide you with that kind of free agency. Why? Because as I mentioned in the article, minds don't exist. Only physical brains exist. And therefore, everything you think you're thinking is simply a response to brain chemistry, over which you have no control. You only think this because it was inevitable that you would think this, because the physical dominoes fell in such a way that you came to this conclusion. There is no other option. You're not reasoning freely between options. You're simply making a decision which is the result of physical events in your brain. Does that make sense? It turns out that when we complain that there should not be any symbols in a classroom, classrooms that are designed to present ideas from which we can freely choose, it turns out you wouldn't have a classroom in which to choose freely unless there is a God who has created you as a free agent in his image so that you can do things freely. But it turns out you would have to have that kind of free agent. You'd have to have a mind first. And that's why I wrote the article. Are people who believe in minds simply ignorant of the science? No, it turns out that there are, and I've written another article I'll show you here. Do neurological studies prove free agency is an illusion? Look, it turns out that no, that there aren't all the studies they might use to show you that minds don't exist actually don't demonstrate that minds don't exist. So I would encourage you to read those two articles. Are people who believe in minds simply ignorant of the science? And do neurological studies prove that free agency is an illusion? Let's talk about whether or not it's possible to have free agency under an atheistic worldview. Now, I love looking at Sam Harris's work only because he seems qualified in a couple of areas. He's a neuroscientist, although he is not actively participating in studies related to neuroscience. That was his degree, so he's obtained a degree in that discipline. and he is holding to an atheistic perspective. So how do I merge these two things? Well, I've written an article about this, which you will find online, and you'll find that at this article, which is Are Atheists Right? Is Free Will an Unnecessary, Unimportant Illusion? Let me just tell you what Sam says from his book, Free Will. What he says is that free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. You are not in control of your mind because you, as a conscious agent, are only part of your mind, living at the mercy of other parts. And that is what he talks about in his book called Free Will. I think that's an astonishingly important admission, because what it means is that you don't have the kind of free... Look, if you think that free agency is not important, understand that free agency sits at the base as the foundation of a bunch of stuff that I would have argued as an atheist were incredibly important. And that is a couple of things. Number one, rationality. You cannot have rationality if I'm not free to choose between rational options. If I'm just inclined and destined to agree with one position or another because of the way my brain chemistry is and the way the neurons are firing, over which I have no control, if all of this is just a physical process, then guess what? I'm not making free choices between rational options. I'm not thinking rationally. I'm not assessing the evidence and making a logical inference. All of that requires free agency first. So if you jettison free agency under an atheistic worldview, you also jettison all the other stuff that comes with it, and rationality is perhaps the most important part. Therefore, classrooms make no sense. Classrooms are the place where we ask students to choose between rational options, to choose freely. We assume up front that they have the ability to choose freely, that they are more than just their physical brains that are predetermined by physical processes that preceded us to make certain choices. We make the assumption up front that they are minds that can act freely, yet, as Sam describes here, you can't get to that kind of mind through a physicalist, atheist universe. That's the first thing. But you also lose a lot more. You lose creativity. You can't be creative unless you're choosing between options. You lose love. You cannot love unless you can love and choose that affection freely. You cannot even be culpable for anything wrong you've ever done unless you actually chose to do that wrong freely. It turns out if you're willing to jettison free agency, you have to jettison pretty much a bunch of other stuff that you would say is important to culture, even if you're not a believer. You have to jettison rationality, the classroom. You have to jettison love, jettison creativity, jettison culpability. This is stuff that we really as a society couldn't function with unless, of course, we have free agency first. But you can't get it, according to the atheist Sam Harris, under atheism. So we can complain from an atheistic perspective that there should be no symbols in the classroom that point to God. But if we do that, we're just demonstrating that God exists because we are free to complain in the first place. And those complaints, we would argue, are rational. But they couldn't be rational unless, of course, God exists. And the very thing you are complaining against would have to exist before you could complain against it. And there's the problem. It turns out that complaints about Christian symbols are actually demonstrate the existence of the very thing you're complaining about. Not only that, moral choices are dependent upon the freedom to choose freely between moral options. I've written about this in an article called Our Sense of Moral Obligation Proves that Materialism is False. What I mean by that is that, so we would say that under an atheistic perspective, all you have, the stuff that makes up the universe, the recipe for the universe is simply made with a few ingredients, space, time, and matter. Matter is really the most important. That we would argue that if you're not a spiritual being, if there is no spiritual side of who we are, if all we are material beings, and then under materialism, all we have are physical, material brains, we don't have immaterial minds. And so my argument is that moral choices requires something beyond what happens. Because I can always argue, well, look, this choice I made was predetermined by physical events that occurred from the beginning of the universe that led up to now. Then my brain, being part of that physical timeline, simply made choices based on physical events that occurred prior, neurons firing. And those choices I made, even moral choices, were not a matter of free agency. They were simply a matter of predetermined destiny, material destiny. Morality actually requires the ability to choose between options. And lastly, I'll point you to a video I've actually done on this, which has become very popular on YouTube, and that is this one, that free agency points to the existence of God. So it turns out that and here's my point in this last segment on the video I posted online. It's that if the entire universe is governed by physics alone, well, physics doesn't have the ability to let go. If it's governed by physics, it's governed by physics. Physics would always be governing the universe. Physics, therefore, everything that happens in you, what you think is your free agency, what you think are your free thoughts, are simply the result of physics in your brain, your physical brain. The physics of your brain are determining how you act, how you move, how you decide, quote unquote, but you're not really deciding. You're simply just acting based on the physics of your brain. If the universe is governed by physics, there is not an option that allows us to have the kind of freedom we have. Now, you might say, well, Jim, I've talked to lots of Christians who believe that God determines everything in advance. Well, fine, there are theological constructs in which you might argue that, hey, isn't theism as restrictive as physicalism? But there are also many theological precepts, theological principles that argue for just, in other words, if there's two options to what's governing the universe, physics or a divine being, it turns out only one of those two options could say, in any given situation, I'm going to let go of my sovereignty so that these free agents can act. Physics can't do that. Physics cannot say, I'm going to stop governing the universe so you have freedom. But a divine being has the ability to interact with its creation. And so that free agency is possible under theism, but absolutely impossible under atheism. Because physics doesn't have the ability to let go. But if there's a divine being that governs the universe, certainly the mystery of how his sovereignty interacts with our free agency, I'm not going to be able to solve that for you in this video. But clearly, only one of these two options, theism or atheism, can give you even the option for free agency, and it's not atheism, it's theism. So my whole point is that we can complain about the symbols of God that are in the classroom, but it turns out that when we complain, we're using the freedom we've been given by God to complain about God. And it also turns out that our complaints are simply demonstrate the fact that if it wasn't for the ability to think freely, you wouldn't have a classroom in which you could learn to begin with. So it turns out you can argue against God, but it's because of God that you have the classroom in the first place. Hope that helps you think about the issues related to these complaints that we're seeing at an increasing pace in our culture. Complaints against God are actually simply evidence that God exists. I'll see you back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.